Chapter 28 of A Gentleman of Leisure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Gentleman of Leisure by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 28. Spennie's Hour of Clear Vision. Mr. McEachern sat in the billiard room smoking. He was alone. From where he sat he could hear distant strains of music. The more rigorous portion of the evening's entertainment, the theatricals, was over, and the nobility and gentry, having done their duty by sitting through the performance, were now enjoying themselves in the ballroom. Everybody was happy. The play had been quite as successful as the usual amateur performance. The prompter had made himself a great favorite from the start, his series of duets with Spennie having been especially admired, and Jimmy, as became an old professional, had played his part with great finish and certainty of touch, though, like the bloodhounds in the performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin on Tour, he had had poor support. But the audience bore no malice. No collection of individuals is less vindictive than an audience at amateur theatricals. It was all over now. Charteris had literally gibbered in the presence of eyewitnesses at one point in the second act, when Spennie, by giving a wrong cue, had jerked the play abruptly into Act 3, where his colleagues, dimly suspecting something wrong, but not knowing what, had kept it for some 2 minutes, to the mystification of the audience. But now even he had begun to forget. As he two-stepped down the room, the lines of agony on his face were softened. He even smiled. As for Spennie, the brilliance of his happy grin dazzled all beholders. He was still wearing it when he invaded the solitude of Mr. McEachern. In every dance, however greatly he may be enjoying it, there comes a time when a man needs a meditative cigarette apart from the throng. It came to Spennie after the 7th item on the program. The billiard-room struck him as admirably suitable in every way. It was not likely to be used as a sitting-out place, and it was near enough to the ballroom to enable him to hear when the music of item number 9 should begin. Mr. McEachern was glad to see him. In the turmoil following the theatricals, he had been unable to get a word with any of the persons with whom he most wished to speak. He had been surprised that no announcement of the engagement had been made at the end of the performance. Spennie would be able to supply him with information as to when the announcement might be expected. Spennie hesitated for an instant when he saw who was in the room. He was not over-anxious for a tete-a-tete with Molly's father just then, but reflecting that, after all, he, Spennie, was not to blame for any disappointment that might be troubling the other, he switched on his grin again and walked in. "Came in for a smoke," he explained by way of opening the conversation. "Not dancing the next." "Come in, my boy, come in," said Mr. McEachern. "I was waiting to see you." Spennie regretted his entrance. He had supposed that the other had heard the news of the breaking off of the engagement. Evidently, from his manner, he had not. This was a nuisance. He sat down and lit a cigarette, casting about the while for an innocuous topic of conversation. "Like the show?" he inquired. "Fine," said Mr. McEachern. "By the way—" Spennie groaned inwardly. He had forgotten that a determined man can change the conversation to any subject he pleases by means of those 3 words. "By the way," said Mr. McEachern, "I thought Sir Thomas— wasn't your uncle intending to announce—" "Well, yes, he was," said Spennie. "Going to declare it during the dancing, maybe?" "Well, no. The fact is, he's not going to do it at all, don't you know." He inspected the red end of his cigarette closely. "As a matter of fact, it's kind of broken off." The other's exclamation jarred on him. Rotten having to talk about this sort of thing. "Broken off?" Spennie nodded. "Miss McEachern thought it over, don't you know," he said, "and came to the conclusion that it wasn't good enough." Now that it was said, he felt easier. It had merely been the awkwardness of having to touch on the thing that had troubled him. That his news might be a blow to Mr. McEachern did not cross his mind. He was a singularly modest youth, and though he realized vaguely that his title had a certain value in some people's eyes, he could not understand anyone mourning over the loss of him as a son-in-law. Katie's father, the old general, thought him a fool, and once during an attack of gout had said so. Oblivious, therefore, to the storm raging a yard away from him, he smoked on with great contentment, till suddenly it struck him that, for a presumably devout lover, jilted that very night, he was displaying too little emotion. He debated swiftly within himself whether he should have a dash at manly grief, but came to the conclusion that it could not be done. Melancholy on this maddest, merriest day of the glad New Year, the day on which he had utterly routed the powers of evil, as represented by Sir Thomas, was impossible. "It wouldn't have done, don't you know," he said. "We weren't suited. What I mean to say is, I'm a bit of a dashed sort of silly ass in some ways, if you know what I mean. A girl like Miss McEachern couldn't have been happy with me. She wants one of those capable, energetic fellers." This struck him as a good beginning, modest but not grovelling. He continued, tapping quite a respectably deep vein of philosophy as he spoke. "You see, dear old top, sir, you see, it's like this. As far as women are concerned, fellers are divided into two classes. There's the masterful, capable Johnnies, and the other sort. Now, I'm the other sort. My idea of the happy married life is to be, well, not exactly downtrodden, but, you know what I mean, kind of second fiddle. I want a wife," his voice grew soft and dreamy, "who'll pet me a good deal, don't you know, strike my hair a lot and all that. I haven't it in me to do the master-in-my-own-house business. For me, the silent devotion touch, sleeping on the mat outside her door, don't you know, when she wasn't feeling well, and being found there in the morning, and being rather cosseted for my thoughtfulness. That's the sort of idea. Hard to put it quite okay, but you know the sort of thing I mean. A fellow's got to realize his jolly old limitations if he wants to be happy though married, what? Now suppose Miss McEachern wants to marry me. Great Scott, she'd be bored to death in a week. Honest, she couldn't help herself. She wants a chap with the same amount of go in him that she's got." He lit another cigarette. He was feeling pleased with himself. Never before had ideas marshalled themselves in his mind in such long and well-ordered ranks. He felt that he could go on talking like this all night. He was getting brainier every minute. He remembered reading in some book somewhere of a girl, or chappie, who had had her, or his, hour of clear vision. This was precisely what had happened now. Whether it was owing to the excitement of what had taken place that night, or because he had been keeping up his thinking powers with excellent dry champagne, he did not know. All he knew was that he felt on top of his subject. He wished he had had a larger audience. "A girl like Miss McEachern," he resumed, "doesn't want any of the hair-stroking business. She'd simply laugh at a feller if he asked for it. She needs a chappie of the get-on-or-get-out type, somebody in the six-cylinder class. And, as a matter of fact, between ourselves, I rather think she's found him." "What?" Mr. McEachern half rose from his chair. All his old fears had come surging back. "What do you mean?" "Fact," said his lordship, nodding. "Mind you, I don't know for certain. As the girl says in the song, I don't know, but I guess. What I mean to say is, they seem jolly friendly and all that, calling each other by their Christian names and so on." "Who?" "Pitt," said his lordship. He was leaning back, blowing a smoke-ring at the moment, so did not see the look on the other's face and the sudden grip of his fingers on the arms of his chair. He went on with some enthusiasm. "Jimmy Pitt," he said. "Now there's a feller, full of oats to the brim, and fairly bursting with go and energy. A girl wouldn't have a dull moment with a chap like that. You know," he proceeded confidentially, "there's a lot in this idea of affinities. Take my word for it, dear old sir. There's a girl up in London, for instance. Now she and I hit it off most amazingly. There's hardly a thing we don't think alike about. For instance, The Merry Widow didn't make a bit of a hit with her, nor did it with me, yet look at the millions of people who raved about it. And neither of us like oysters. We're affinities, that's why. You see the same sort of thing all over the place." It's a jolly queer business. Sometimes makes me believe in what's-its-name, you know what I mean. All that in the poem, you know. How does it go? When you were a tiddly-om-pom and I was a thingamajig. Dashed brainy bit of work. I was reading it only the other day. Well, what I mean to say is, it's my belief that Jimmy Pitt and Miss McEachern are by way of being something in that line. Doesn't it strike you that they are just the sort to get on together? You can see it with half an eye. You can't help liking a fellow like Jimmy Pitt. He's a sport. I wish I could tell you some of the things he's done, but I can't, for reasons. But you can take it from me, he's a sport. You ought to cultivate him. You'd like him. Oh, dash it, there's the music. I must be off. Got to dance this one." He rose from his chair and dropped his cigarette into the ashtray. "So long," he said with a friendly nod. "Wish I could stop, but it's no go. That's the last let-up I shall have tonight." He went out, leaving Mr. McEachern seated in his chair, a prey to many and varied emotions. End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Gentleman of Leisure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Gentleman of Leisure by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 29. The Last Round. He had only been gone a few minutes when Mr. McEachern's meditations were again interrupted. This time the visitor was a stranger to him, a dark-faced, clean-shaven man. He did not even wear evening clothes, so could not be one of the guests, and Mr. McEachern could not place him immediately. Then he remembered. He had seen him in Sir Thomas Blunt's dressing-room. This was Sir Thomas's valet. "Might I have a word with you, sir?" "What is it?" asked McEachern, staring heavily. His mind had not recovered from the effect of Lord Drever's philosophical remarks. There was something of a cloud on his brain. To judge from his lordship's words, things had been happening behind his back, and the idea of Molly deceiving him was too strange to be assimilated in an instant. He looked at the valet dully. "What is it?" he asked again. "I must apologize for intruding, but I thought it best to approach you before making my report to Sir Thomas." "Your report?" "I am employed by a private inquiry agency." "What?" "Yes, sir. Rags. You may have heard of us in Holborn Bars. Very old established, divorce a specialty. You will have seen the advertisements. Sir Thomas wrote asking for a man, and the governor sent me down. I have been with the house some years. My job, I gathered, was to keep my eyes open generally. Sir Thomas, it seemed, had no suspicions of any definite person. I was to be on the spot just in case, in a manner of speaking. And it's precious lucky I was, or her ladyship's jewels would have been gone. I've done a fair cop this very night." He paused and eyed the ex-policeman keenly. McEachern was obviously excited. Could Jimmy have made an attempt on the jewels during the dance? Or Spike? "Say," he said, "was it a red-headed—" The detective was watching him with a curious smile. "No, he wasn't red-headed. You seem interested, sir. I thought you would be. I will tell you all about it. I had had my suspicions of this party ever since he arrived, and I may say that it struck me at the time that there was something mighty fishy about the way he got into the castle." McEachern started. So he had not been the only one to suspect Jimmy's motives in attaching himself to Lord Drever. "Go on," he said. "I suspected that there was some game on, and it struck me that this would be the day for the attempt, the house being upside down, in a manner of speaking, on account of the theatricals. And I was right. I kept near those jewels on and off all day, and presently, just as I had thought, along comes this fellow. He'd hardly got to the door when I was on him. Good boy, you're no rube. We fought for a while, but, being a bit to the good in strength, and knowing something about the game, I had my irons on him pretty quick, and took him off and locked him in the cellar. That's how it was, sir." Mr. McEachern's relief was overwhelming. If Lord Drever's statement was correct, and Jimmy had really succeeded in winning Molly's affection, this would be indeed a rescue at the 11th hour. It was with a nunc dimittis air he felt for his cigar case and extended it towards the detective. A cigar from his own private case was with him a mark of the supremest favour and goodwill, a sort of accolade which he bestowed only upon the really meritorious few. Usually it was received with becoming deference, but on this occasion there was a somewhat startling deviation from routine, for just as he was opening the case, something cold and hard pressed against each of his wrists. There was a snap and a click, and looking up, dazed, he saw that the detective had sprung back, and was contemplating him with a grim smile over the barrel of an ugly-looking little revolver. Guilty or innocent, the first thing a man does, when he finds handcuffs on his wrists, is to try to get them off. The action is automatic. Mr. McEachern strained at the steel chain till the veins stood out on his forehead. His great body shook with rage. The detective eyed his efforts with some satisfaction. The picture presented by the other, as he heaved and tugged, was that of a guilty man trapped. "It's no good, my friend," he said. His voice brought McEachern back to his senses. In the first shock of the thing, the primitive man in him had led him beyond the confines of self-restraint. He had simply struggled unthinkingly. Now he came to himself again. He shook his manacled hands furiously. "What does this mean?" he shouted. "What the—" "Less noise," said the detective sharply. "Get back," he snapped, as the other took a step forward. "Do you know who I am?" thundered McEachern. "No," said the detective, "and that's just why you're wearing those bracelets. Come now, don't be a fool. The game's up, can't you see that?" McEachern leaned helplessly against the billiard table. He felt weak. Everything was unreal. Had he gone mad, he wondered? "That's right," said the detective. "Stay there. You can't do any harm there. It was a pretty little game, I'll admit. You worked it well, meeting your old friend from New York and all, and having him invited to the castle. Very pretty. New York, indeed. Seen about as much of New York as I have of Timbuktu. I saw through him." Some inkling of the truth began to penetrate McEachern's consciousness. He had become so obsessed with the idea that, as the captive was not Spike, it must be Jimmy, that the possibility of Mr. Gaylor being the subject of discussion only dawned upon him now. "What do you mean?" he cried. "Who is it that you have arrested?" "Blessed if I know. You can tell me that, I should think, seeing he's an old Timbuktu friend of yours. Gaylor's the name he goes by here." "Gaylor." "That's the man. And do you know what he had the impudence, the gall to tell me? That he was in my own line of business. A detective. He said you had sent for him to come here." He laughed amusedly at the recollection. "And so he is, you fool. So I did." "Oh, you did you? And what business had you bringing detectives into other people's houses?" Mr. McEachern started to answer, but checked himself. Never before had he appreciated to the full the depth and truth of the proverb relating to the frying pan and the fire. To clear himself, he must mention his suspicions of Jimmy, and also his reasons for those suspicions. And to do that would mean revealing his past. It was Scylla and Charybdis. A drop of perspiration trickled down his temple. "What's the good?" said the detective. "Mighty ingenious idea, that, only you hadn't allowed for there being a real detective in the house. It was that chap pitching me that yarn that made me suspicious of you. I put two and two together. Partners, I said to myself. I'd heard all about you, scraping acquaintance with Sir Thomas and all. Mighty ingenious. You become the old family friend, and then you let in your pal. He gets the stuff and hands it over to you. Nobody dreams of suspecting you, and there you are. Honestly now, wasn't that the game?" "It's all a mistake," McEachern was beginning when the door-handle turned. The detective looked over his shoulder. McEachern glared dumbly. This was the crowning blow, that there should be spectators of his predicament. Jimmy strolled into the room. "Drever told me you were in here," he said to McEachern. "Can you spare me a— Hello?" The detective had pocketed his revolver at the first sound of the handle. To be discreet was one of the chief articles in the creed of the young men from Ragg's detective agency, but handcuffs are not easily concealed. Jimmy stood staring in amazement at McEachern's wrists. "Some sort of a round game?" he inquired with interest. The detective became confidential. "It's this way, Mr. Pitt. There's been some pretty deep work going on here. There's a regular gang of burglars in the place. This chap here's one of them." "What? Mr. McEachern?" "That's what he calls himself." It was all Jimmy could do to keep himself from asking Mr. McEachern whether he attributed his downfall to drink. He contented himself with a sorrowful shake of the head at the fermenting captive. Then he took up the part of counsel for the defense. "I don't believe it," he said. "What makes you think so?" "Why, this afternoon I caught this man's pal, the fellow that calls himself Gaylor." "I know the man," said Jimmy. "He's a detective, really. Mr. McEachern brought him down here." The sleuth's jaw dropped limply, as if he had received a blow. "What?" he said in a feeble voice. "Didn't I tell you—" began Mr. McEachern, but the sleuth was occupied with Jimmy. That sickening premonition of disaster was beginning to steal over him. Dimly he began to perceive that he had blundered. "Yes," said Jimmy. "Why, I can't say, but Mr. McEachern was afraid someone might try to steal Lady Julia Blunt's rope of diamonds, so he wrote to London for this man Gaylor. It was officious, perhaps, but not criminal. I doubt if, legally, you could handcuff a man for a thing like that. What have you done with good Mr. Gaylor?" "I've locked him in the coal cellar," said the detective dismally. The thought of the interview in prospect with the human bloodhound he had so mishandled was not exhilarating. "Locked him in the cellar, did you?" said Jimmy. "Well, well, I dare say he's very happy there. He's probably busy detecting blackbeetles. Still, perhaps you had better go and let him out. Possibly if you were to apologize to him? Eh? Just as you think. I only suggest. If you want somebody to vouch for Mr. McEachern's non-burglariousness, I can do it. He is a gentleman of private means, and we knew each other out in New York." "I never thought—" "That," said Jimmy, with sympathetic friendliness, "if you will allow me to say so, is the cardinal mistake you detectives make. You never do think." "It never occurred to me—" He took the key of the handcuffs from his pocket and toyed with it. Mr. McEachern emitted a low growl. It was enough. "If you wouldn't mind, Mr. Pitt," said the detective obsequiously. He thrust the key into Jimmy's hands and fled. Jimmy unlocked the handcuffs. Mr. McEachern rubbed his wrists. "Ingenious little things," said Jimmy. "I'm much obliged to you," growled Mr. McEachern, without looking up. "Not at all. A pleasure. This circumstantial evidence business is the devil, isn't it? I knew a man who broke into a house in New York to win a bet, and to this day the owner of the house thinks him a professional burglar." "How's that?" said Mr. McEachern sharply. "Why do I say a man? Why am I so elusive and mysterious? You're quite right. It sounds more dramatic, but after all, what you want is facts. Very well. I broke into your house that night to win a bet. That's the limpid truth." McEachern was staring at him. Jimmy proceeded. "You are just about to ask, what was Spike Mullins doing with me? Well, Spike had broken into my flat an hour before, and I took him along with me as a sort of guide, philosopher, and friend." "Spike Mullins said you were a burglar from England." "I'm afraid I rather led him to think so. I had been to see the opening performance of a burglar play called Love the Cracksman that night, and I worked off on Spike some severely technical information I had received from a pal of mine who played the lead in the show. I told you when I came in that I had been talking to Lord Drever. Well, what he was saying to me was that he had met this very actor-man, a fellow called Mifflin, Arthur Mifflin, in London just before he met me." He's in London now, rehearsing for a show that's come over from America. You see the importance of this item? It means that if you doubt my story, all you need to do is to find Mifflin. I forget what theater his play is coming on at, but you could find out in a second, and ask him to corroborate. Are you satisfied?" McEachern did not answer. An hour before, he would have fought to the last ditch for his belief in Jimmy's crookedness, but the events of the last 10 minutes had shaken him. He felt something of a reaction in Jimmy's favor. "Look here, Mr. McEachern," said Jimmy, "I wish you would listen quietly to me for a minute or two. There's really no reason on earth why we should be at one another's throats in this way. We might as well be friends. Let's shake hands and call the fight off. I suppose you know why I came here to see you?" McEachern did not speak. "You know that your daughter has broken off her engagement to Lord Drever?" "Then he was right," said McEachern, half to himself. "It is you?" Jimmy nodded. McEachern drummed his fingers on the table and stared thoughtfully at him. "Is Molly—" he said at length. "Does Molly—" "Yes," said Jimmy. McEachern continued his drumming. "Don't think there's been anything underhand about this," said Jimmy. "She's absolutely refused to do anything unless you gave your consent. She said you had been partners all her life, and she was going to do the square thing by you." "She did?" said McEachern eagerly. "I think you ought to do the square thing by her. I'm not much, but she wants me. Do the square thing by her." McEachern was staring straight in front of him. There was a look in his eyes which Jimmy had never seen there before, a frightened, hunted look. "It's too late," he burst out. "I'll be square with her now, but it's too late. I won't stand in her way when I can make her happy. But I'll lose her. Oh, my God, I'll lose her." "Did you think I had never said to myself," he went on, "the things you said to me that day when we met here? Did you think I didn't know what I was? Who should know it better than myself? But she didn't. I'd kept it from her. I'd sweat for fear she would find out some day. When I came over here, I thought I was safe. And then you came, and I saw you together. I thought you were a crook. You were with Mullins in New York. I told her you were a crook." "You told her that?" "I said I knew it. I couldn't tell her the truth why I thought so. I said I had made inquiries in New York and found out about you." Jimmy saw now. The mystery was solved. So that was why Molly had allowed them to force her into the engagement with Drever. "I see," he said slowly. McEachern gripped the table in silence. "I see," said Jimmy again. "You mean she'll want an explanation?" He thought for a moment. "You must tell her," he said quickly. "For your own sake, you must tell her. Go and do it now. Wake up, man!" He shook him by the shoulder. "Go and do it now. She'll forgive you. Don't be afraid of that. Go and look for her and tell her now." McEachern roused himself. "I will," he said. "It's the only way," said Jimmy. McEachern opened the door, then fell back a pace. Jimmy could hear voices in the passage outside. He recognized Lord Drever's. McEachern continued to back away from the door. Lord Drever entered, with Molly on his arm. "Hello," said his lordship, looking round. "Hello, Pitt. Here we all are, what?" "Lord Drever wanted to smoke," said Molly. She smiled, but there was anxiety in her eyes. She looked quickly at her father and at Jimmy. "Molly, my dear," said McEachern huskily, "I want to speak to you for a moment." Jimmy took his lordship by the arm. "Come along, Drever," he said. "You can come and sit out with me. We'll go and smoke on the terrace." They left the room together. "What does the old boy want?" inquired his lordship. "Are you and Miss McEachern—" "We are," said Jimmy. "By Jove! I say, old chap, million congratulations and all that sort of rot, you know." His lordship had to resume his duties in the ballroom after a while, but Jimmy sat on, smoking and thinking. In the general stillness the opening of the door at the top of the steps came sharply to his ears. He looked up. 2 figures were silhouetted for a moment against the light, and then the door closed again. They began to move slowly down the steps. Jimmy had recognized them. He got up. He was in the shadow. They could not see him. They began to walk down the terrace. They were quite close now. Neither was speaking, but presently, when they were but a few feet away, they stopped. There was the splutter of a match, and McEachern lit a cigar. In the yellow light his face was clearly visible. Jimmy looked and was content. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Gentleman of Leisure. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Gentleman of Leisure by P.G. Wodehouse. Chapter 30. Conclusion. The American liner St. Louis lay in the Empress dock at Southampton, taking aboard her passengers. All sorts and conditions of men flowed in an unceasing stream up the gangway. Leaning over the second-class railing, Jimmy Pitt and Spike Mullins watched them thoughtfully. "Well, Spike," said Jimmy, "your schooner's on the tide now, isn't it? Your vessel's at the quay. You've got some queer-looking fellow-travelers. Don't miss the 2 Cingalese sports and the man in the turban and baggy breeches. I wonder if they're airtight. Useful if he fell overboard." "Sure," said Spike, directing a contemplative eye towards the garment in question. "He knows his business." "I wonder what those men on the deck are writing. They've been scribbling away ever since we came here. Probably society journalists. We shall see in the next week's papers, 'Among the second-class passengers we notice Mr. Spike Mullins looking as cheery as ever.' It's a pity you're so set on going, Spike. Why not change your mind and stop?" For a moment Spike looked wistful. Then his countenance resumed its woodenness. "There ain't no use for me on dis side, boss," he said. "New York's the spot. Yous don't want none of me now you're married. How's Miss Molly, boss?" "Splendid, Spike, thanks. We're going over to France by tonight's boat." "It's been a queer business," said Jimmy after a pause. "A deuced queer business. Still, I've come very well out of it, at any rate. It seems to me that you're the only one of us who doesn't end happily, Spike. I'm married. McEachern's butted into society so deep that it would take an excavating party with dynamite to get him out of it. Molly, well, Molly's made a bad bargain, but I hope she won't regret it. We're all going some, except you. You're going out on the old trail again, which begins in 3rd Avenue and ends in Sing Sing. Why tear yourself away, Spike?" Spike concentrated his gaze on a weedy young emigrant in a blue jersey, who was having his eye examined by the overworked doctor, and seemed to be resenting it. "There's nothin' doin' on dis side, boss," he said at length. "I want to get busy." "Ulysses Mullins," said Jimmy, looking at him curiously. "I know the feeling. There's only one cure. I sketched it out for you once, but I doubt if you'll ever take it. You don't think a lot of women, do you? You're the rugged bachelor." "Goils," began Spike comprehensively, and abandoned the topic without dilating on it further. "Those were great jewels, boss," said Spike thoughtfully. "I believe you're still brooding over them, Spike." "We could have got away with 'em, if you'd have stood for it. Dead easy." "You are brooding over them. Spike, I'll tell you something which will console you a little before you start out on your wanderings. It's in confidence, so keep it dark. That necklace was paste." "What's that?" "Nothing but paste. I spotted it directly you handed them to me. It wasn't worth $100. A light of understanding came into Spike's eyes. His face beamed with the smile of one to whom dark matters are made clear. "So that's why you wouldn't stand for getting away with it," he exclaimed. The last voyager had embarked. The deck was full to congestion. "They'll be sending us ashore in a minute," said Jimmy. "I'd better be moving. Let me know how you're getting on, Spike, from time to time. You know the address. And I say, it's just possible you may find you want $1 or two every now and then, when you're going to buy another aeroplane, for instance. Well, you know where to write for it, don't you?" "Thanks, boss, but that'll be all right. I'm going to sit in on another game this time. Politics, boss. A friend of a mug what I knows has gotten a pull. He'll find me a job." "Politics," said Jimmy. "I never thought of that. My brother Dan is an alderman with a grip on the 7th Ward," he quoted softly. "Why, you'll be a boss before you know where you are." "Sure," said Spike, grinning modestly. "You ought to be a thundering success in American politics," said Jimmy. "You've got all the necessary qualities." A steward passed. "Any more for the shore?" "Well, Spike," said Jimmy. "Goodbye, boss." "Goodbye," said Jimmy, "and good luck." The sun had gone behind the clouds. As the ship slid out on its way, a stray beam pierced the grayness. It shone on a red head. End of Chapter 30. The End of A Gentleman of Leisure by P.G. Wodehouse.